Indigenous.
You are the end of time. You think it's some like God. All the river nights that were spent back.
Good day, relatives. Happy New Year 2025 from the Thunderbird Group podcast. I'm Eddie Moonville, your host, here to bring you stories, voices, and teachings that honor our connection to the land, our traditions, and to each other. Each episode, we dive into topics that uplift Indigenous knowledge, resilience, and creativity, exploring everything from culture and community to healing and sovereignty. Today's episode is an important one. We're diving deep into the story of Leonard Peltier, a name that carries profound meaning in the struggle for Indigenous justice. His journey is one of resilience and resistance, sparking global conversations about freedom, sovereignty, and human rights. Stay with us as we explore his life, the ongoing fight for his freedom, and the larger context of justice for Indigenous peoples. It's a story that calls us to reflect, to act, and to honor our shared responsibility to each other. Let's begin.
And I'm June Horsefeather. It's an honor to be here with you all, adding my voice to these conversations alongside Eddie. Before we begin, we want to take a moment to acknowledge the fires and destruction that have impacted so many lives across America. Our hearts and prayers go out to all who have lost so much, to the families grieving their loved ones, to those displaced from their homes, and to the communities working tirelessly to recover. We stand with you in solidarity, sending strength and love as you navigate this challenging time. Let us hold these relatives in our thoughts as we move forward with today's episode, Honoring Resilience in All Its Forms. Welcome to today's deep dive. We're going to be talking about the case of Leonard Peltier. Really fascinating case, but also incredibly frustrating. Leonard Peltier is an Indigenous activist who's been in prison for almost 50 years now for the murder of 2 FBI agents, a crime that he's always said he did not commit. This case has really drawn a lot of attention from all over the world. You've got big names like Nelson Mandela, Amnesty International, even some of the people involved in the original prosecution have called for his release. So you know right off the bat it's a pretty complicated story. And we've got a lot of sources to help us understand it. We've got court documents, articles, interviews, the whole 9 yards.
Our mission today is to go through all of that and explore different perspectives. And hopefully we'll leave you thinking about some pretty big questions about what justice means. In this case, and really in a broader sense too.
Okay, so let's rewind a little bit back to the beginning. For those who maybe aren't familiar with the case, can you give us a quick overview of who Leonard Peltier is and how he ended up in prison?
Sure. So Leonard Peltier was convicted in 1977 for the murders of 2 FBI agents, Jack Kohler and Ronald Williams. This all happened during a shootout on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. At the time, he was a member of the American Indian movement. AIM,
right. They were making headlines for their protests and occupations, really shaking things up. Before we go into the details of the shootout and the trial, can you explain a little more about AIM, what it was all about, and what was the atmosphere like on Pine Ridge back then?
Yeah, so AIM was founded in 1968. It was really a response to the injustices and the oppression that Native Americans were facing. They were known for their direct actions, so things like occupying government buildings, organizing marches. One of the most famous actions was the Trail of Broken Treaties in 1972. Thousands of Native Americans marched on Washington, D.C. They presented a list of grievances to the government. It was a really powerful statement that they weren't afraid to challenge the status quo.
They were making their voices heard, but why was Pine Ridge in particular such a volatile place at that time?
Pine Ridge, unfortunately, was really a microcosm of the struggles a lot of Native American communities were going through. Poverty, broken treaties, just a sense of being ignored and mistreated by the government. It all created this really tense environment. And AIM, being present on the reservation, just really added to the tension that was already there.
Okay, so it sounds like things were already pretty heated even before the shootout. This wasn't just some random isolated incident.
Exactly. The shootout itself took place at Jumping Bull Ranch on June 26, 1975. Now, the details of exactly what happened are still being debated. Who fired first? Who actually killed the agents at close range? These questions are really at the heart of all the controversies surrounding Leonard Peltier's case.
It's interesting, too, because 3 AIM members were charged in connection with the deaths of the agents: Leonard Peltier, Darrell Dean Butler, and Robert Robideau. But Butler and Robideau were acquitted. They claimed self-defense. So how is it that Peltier ends up with 2 life sentences if his co-defendants were found not guilty?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Peltier was actually tried separately, and his trial, I think it's safe to say, was a lot more politically charged. Some people believe he was made an example of because he was a leader with an aim, a symbol of resistance.
So are you saying it's possible that the outcome of his trial was influenced by things that went beyond just the evidence?
I think that's certainly a perspective a lot of people hold. The prosecution's case against him rested heavily on eyewitness testimony and ballistics evidence. But over time, there have been serious questions raised about how reliable that evidence actually was.
Like the witness Myrtle Poorbear. She later recanted her testimony and said that she was coerced by the FBI to ID Peltier as the shooter. And then there were the ballistics tests. The prosecution said a shell casing found near the agents' bodies matched a rifle that belonged to Peltier, but later analyses couldn't conclusively prove that.
Yeah, and to add to all of that, there are also allegations that the FBI withheld evidence that could help Peltier's defense, what they call exculpatory evidence, information that could cast doubt on his guilt.
So if the evidence was shaky, and there are claims the FBI withheld information, why hasn't there been more movement towards a retrial or some kind of review of his conviction?
Well, for one thing, overturning a conviction is really tough, especially one that's been upheld on appeal. But then there's also the political side of it. This is a high-profile case, and the FBI has always maintained that Peltier is guilty.
It almost feels like there's something bigger going on here than just the legal case.
I think it's fair to say that this case has become about a lot more than just what happened that day at Jumping Bull Ranch. It's become a symbol of the injustices Native Americans have faced and the complicated relationship between the government and Indigenous communities.
Before we get into the international support for Peltier and where things stand today, I want to step back for a second and talk about Leonard Peltier, the person. What led him to become such a prominent activist in the first place?
Well, to understand his path, you have to look at his early life. He was born in 1944, grew up on the Turtle Mountain Reservation in North Dakota, one of 13 children, experienced hardship from a young age, including the forced assimilation policies of those government-run Indian boarding schools. Those schools were designed to strip Native American children of their culture and language. It was really traumatic for a lot of people.
I can see why someone who went through that would want to become an advocate for their people.
Definitely. Those early experiences, along with the discrimination and the injustices Native Americans face, all of that fueled his passion to fight for change.
I read he moved to Seattle for a while and was running an auto body shop. He was balancing that with all this activism.
He was, which says a lot about his dedication. Committed to taking care of himself, but also working toward a better future for his community.
So a working man who was also deeply committed to activism, what was it about AIM that appealed to him?
I think AIM's approach really resonated with him. They weren't afraid to be confrontational and push the boundaries of what was considered acceptable protest.
And he was involved in some of their big actions. The Trail of Broken Treaties March, and I understand he was there for the occupation of the Bureau of Indian Affairs headquarters.
That's right. They took over the BIA building in D.C. for 7 days, demanding accountability for how the government was handling treaty obligations and resources. It was a bold move, and it really cemented AIM's reputation as a group you couldn't ignore.
So by the time we get to Pine Ridge, Peltier's already deeply involved in the movement. Clearly someone willing to put himself on the line for what he believed in.
And that context is really crucial for understanding his case and all the emotions surrounding it on all sides.
We've got this backdrop of injustice, a really tense situation at Pine Ridge, and then this controversial trial with questions about the evidence. It's no surprise this case has gotten so much attention and debate over the years.
It's become a symbol for a lot of people.
Yeah.
They see it as an example of the bias against Native Americans in the justice system.
His case has attracted some really high-profile supporters, too. I mean, Nelson Mandela, Desmond Tutu, the Dalai Lama, even Amnesty International. What are their main arguments for releasing Peltier?
They say he didn't get a fair trial, that the evidence was messed up, and that keeping him in prison violates his human rights. And they also see it as symbolic, of how the U.S. government has treated Indigenous people, historically and even today.
It's a powerful statement when you have people of that stature speaking out.
Absolutely. And Peltier himself has always said he's innocent throughout all these years in prison.
There's a clip from 2012 where Peltier addresses this directly. He was talking to Democracy Now! From prison, and he actually spoke to President Obama at the time.
Oh, let's hear it?
He said, and I quote, "I just hope he can, stop the wars that are going on in this world and stop killing all those people getting killed, and give the Black Hills back to my people and turn me loose."
Wow.
And in that same interview, he talks about hoping for clemency.
What did he say?
He said, I've never got a fair trial for one. They wouldn't allow me to put up a defense and manufactured evidence, manufactured witnesses, tortured witnesses, The list just goes on. So I think I'm a very good candidate for, after 37 years, for clemency or house arrest, at least.
It's really tough to hear him talking about wanting to be free after all this time, especially knowing that he's 80 years old now and dealing with some serious health issues.
Yeah, he's been hospitalized several times in recent years. And he needs a walker just to get around. His supporters say keeping him in prison at this point is just cruel, especially given his age and his health.
I remember reading something about a recent parole hearing.
There was one in July, his first full reconsideration hearing since 2008.
So did he get parole?
No, unfortunately. The parole commission denied his request. They said his crimes were too serious, and they pointed to the FBI, still objecting to his release.
You mentioned the health problems. How's he being treated in prison? There have been reports of frequent lockdowns, which means he has very limited access to things like medical care, religious services, even just basic human interaction.
Lockdowns for an 80-year-old with health problems, that seems extreme.
His supporters call it retaliation for his activism, a way to keep him quiet. They think the prison is intentionally making his life difficult, even now.
So what can Peltier and his supporters do at this point? Is there any chance he could still be released?
His legal team is looking at all the options. Appealing the parole decision, maybe even a new lawsuit.
What about President Biden? Doesn't he have the power to grant clemency?
He does. He could commute Peltier's sentence or even pardon him.
But would he actually do that? It seems like a pretty controversial move considering everything surrounding this case.
It would be a big decision for sure, but it's something Peltier's supporters have been pushing for. They say it would be a huge step towards justice and reconciliation.
This case is about so much more than just one man.
It really is.
It's about the history between the U.S. government and Native Americans.
And about systemic racism, the use of power, even the definition of justice itself.
And these questions are still so relevant.
Absolutely.
Even after almost 50 years.
Peltier's case resonates with so many people. They see it as a reflection of the ongoing struggle for Indigenous rights.
We actually came across a plea for clemency from back during the Trump administration, and it really shows how much support there is for Peltier and how important this case is. It says, as Leonard Peltier, now 79 years old, enters his 5th decade of incarceration, the time has come to address one of the most pressing cases of injustice in modern American history. It's pretty amazing to think that this has been going on for so long and people are still so passionate about it.
It speaks volumes about the deep-seated issues of injustice and inequality in our society.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I have to ask, what does justice for Leonard Peltier look like?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Is it immediate release? A retrial? Does the U.S. government need to formally acknowledge that they did wrong? Or is it something else entirely?
It's tough, right? It doesn't feel like there's an easy answer here. But maybe that's what makes this case so interesting, makes you think about some uncomfortable things. About history, about the justice system.
I think so. It makes you really think about what justice even means. Is it about punishment? Or is it about accountability? Or is it more about healing and trying to reconcile?
Those are big questions, and everyone's going to have a different answer.
Yeah, and that's why we really encourage you, the listener. Go check out the sources we've got listed, do your own research, and decide what you think about the Leonard Peltier case.
Don't just take our word for it. Explore it, look at the different sides, all the evidence, the arguments for and against his release.
This is a story that needs to be told, and this conversation needs to keep going.
Because at the end of the day, the Leonard Peltier case, it's not just about him. It's about the whole history of the U.S. and its Indigenous people. It's about the fight for their rights, for recognition, and it's about what justice means in a country that's still dealing with its past.
It's a reminder that this fight for equality and justice, it never really ends. And we all have a part to play in making things better, more just, more equal.
Well, on that note, we're going to wrap up our deep dive into the Leonard Peltier case. We hope this gave you something to think about, maybe inspired you to learn more. Thanks for being with us today.
Mr. President, I humbly ask you to consider my request for clemency, not just for myself, but for the healing of my people in this nation. For nearly 5 decades, I have maintained my innocence while serving a sentence rooted in a time of great conflict and misunderstanding. My continued incarceration is a heavy burden, not only on me, but on the many who believe in justice and fairness. I do not ask for freedom out of bitterness or anger, but with hope for compassion and the possibility of healing. I pray that my release may serve as a step toward mending the broken relationship between Native nations and the United States. I remain steadfast in my commitment to peace, and I hope for the chance to live the rest of my life in dignity and freedom. Creator, hear my prayer for our people. In these times of challenge, when the truth rises to the surface and the struggle for justice feels unending, I pray for strength, for myself, for my brothers and sisters, and for all who walk this path with open hearts. May we stand together as one, guided by the wisdom of our ancestors, who remind us that justice is not just for the few, but for the earth, for the people, and for the generations yet to come. I pray for healing, for the wounds inflicted on our people, our land, and our spirits. May we find the courage to forgive, yet never forget the lessons that have shaped our journey. May we honor our struggles not with bitterness, but with a commitment to build a world rooted in truth, respect, and balance. Creator, let us be warriors of peace, speaking not with hatred, but with clarity and love for what is right. In this fight for justice, give us patience, for justice does not come swiftly. Give us resilience, for the road is long. And give us hope, for hope is the fire that keeps us alive. For all people, for all nations, for all life, I pray for unity. Let the truth set us free. I am Leonard Peltier, and I live for freedom. Aho for all my relations.
We hana yo we